All right, everybody, and welcome back to our second video in recognition prime decision making and the maritime environment. This episode, we're going to be discussing the consequence frequency matrix. Joining me again are Mr. Richard Olson and Mr. Reed Hodgkin. Rich, why don't you tell us a little bit about Reed? I'm sorry. Why don't you recap for us what recognition prime decision making is?
All right. Well, I'll spend a minute going over some of the things that we actually talked about in the last video. So if you want more detail, just go have a look at that video again. But basically, what we're talking about is decision making, and particularly a particular subset of decision making. So in decision making, there's usually a problem to be solved. For instance, you're approaching another vessel from the stern. There are options available for you to choose from, usually multiple options. I could slow down or I could change course. And then the decision itself is a choice among the options that you have. So that's what a decision is. Very often in the kinds of decisions that we're talking about, judgment is required. And we're going to work a lot on how you get to the judgment. One of the one category that we're really talking about in earnest in the videos that we're producing here is critical decision making. Decisions that have strong import. There's important consequences associated with the decisions, sometimes even life and death. So the decision is often time critical. The data that you're going to use to make the decision are incomplete or sometimes even suspect. And like I said earlier, the consequences are significant. Now, research has shown that humans naturally operate in a particular way in these circumstances. It's different from the normal decision making that you make on board or in the office. Psychological research has identified a very useful model for how people think in these situations. That model is called the recognition prime decision model. And basically, the key components or the concepts that we use in the recognition prime decision model are: one, you gather the key information, the right data about the situation that you need, not extraneous, but the right information. You use that information that you've gathered to trigger recognition, of a similar experience that you've had or that you've heard about. This is where experience comes into play. Then you use that experience that you remembered to jumpstart your decision making. Makes it much faster and much more accurate. You identify the first good enough solution or option that you can use to resolve the situation based on your experience. Then you modify that solution, what you learned about before, for the special parts of the circumstances that exist today that aren't like anything you've seen in the past. Then finally, you test that solution for practicality, you implement it, and then you assess it and modify it as you continue to go through the situation to make sure it's working throughout. Now, inherent in critical decision making, when it's done right, is an assessment of risk. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rich to talk to us about risk in decision making for critical decisions. Rich?
Thank you, Reed. So today we're going to talk more about how risk is a factor of frequency and consequences. So when we talk about this, and we know there's multiple equations and multiple determinations of risk, but when we're talking about decision making, we're talking about frequency and consequences. So when we talk about frequency, how many times have you dealt with this situation? Is this new to you, or is this something that you do all the time? Then the next is going to be consequences. So what happens when this happens? What will happen if you make the wrong decision? What will happen when the decision you make goes bad, goes south? So in this case, we're looking at decision-making risk, where risk is a function of consequences and frequency. So to go into that, there's a matrix. It's called the decision-making matrix, or the decision risk matrix. And it's 4 quadrants. So we're looking at the 4 quadrants of frequency on consequences. So if you notice, high frequency, low consequences, low frequency, low consequences, that's all green. So that's basically a safe space. The decisions are either you've dealt with it often, and if you make the wrong decision, not much happens. That could be sitting out in the open ocean, leaving a fresh third mate on the bridge for a couple of hours, by himself, leaving him on his watch, 4-hour watch by himself, checking him. As a seasoned captain, you've done this over time. You know through your frequency how often you have to leave someone. How do you size someone up? And that's the same thing with the low consequences, low frequency. If your decision isn't going to really have a large impact, have a situation where the consequences are very high, you're in the green. Now we're going to move over to the yellow area, and that's the high consequences, high frequency. So that means your decision, very high consequences, but you've been through it before. So let's take a captain coming in through a high traffic area, high traffic scheme, and you have a fresh third mate on. This is maybe the third mate's first time out at sea, but you as the captain have been into this port many times, have dealt with this situation, have dealt with how the vessels operate and what you have to look for, and you may feel comfortable leaving that third there and just giving that third guidance on how to handle the situation, and know that you have to come through, that you may just have to take over when needed. Now let's look at the high consequence, low frequency. That's the area that we want to stay away from. That's the area that we don't have much experience in that box. We haven't dealt with the incidents that much. We haven't been exposed to them. But the issue is that if something goes wrong, it's a bad consequence. It's a high consequences. So let's look at that same situation going back into a vessel traffic scheme, but we don't have a seasoned crew. We don't have people on the bridge that know that traffic scheme. We don't have people on the bridge that have experience in that port. So what happens, and there's many lessons learned out there in many cases in the last 5 years, where we've had vessel accidents. Now we have to factor in the time for decisions. Also affects the risk factor. We can be in that red area, but say we have a hurricane coming and the captain hasn't sailed through major storms or hasn't been in heavy weather as much as captain. Not saying that this person hasn't done it, but we're saying as the master of the vessel. So his time, especially with a hurricane, he has lead time. He has factors to look at. But now all of a sudden, say you're in the middle of the ocean and you don't have that time. You don't have time to make a decision. Now all of a sudden that risk increases. So not only are we looking at risk as a function of frequency and consequences, then we add that other component, the time needed to make that decision. And the point is that this all affects decision making, but it also deals with people. How do we get people to take low frequency and increase that to a medium frequency, a high frequency? And that comes in with experience. And how do we get people with that experience? That's through on-the-job training. That's through mentoring. That's also through a training program. And that's where we can give people simulations and ways to gain that experience.
Thanks, Rich. And one of the things we worry about in the maritime industry is high consequence, low frequency events. Now, one of the things just mentioned are traffic scenarios, but something else we train for and drill for in the maritime industry are fires. Now, I can take an average Class A fire, common combustible, light a trash can, and 99% of my crew will know what to do and the sequence of events as to how to fight the fire, raise the alarm, etc. But you take that same crew member and have them see a fire coming out of a container. Now, all of a sudden, we have a lot more issues that we're dealing with. Do we know the contents of the container? Do we have a safety data sheet, a material data sheet available to know how to fight that particular fire in that container? So we go from something that we've trained for to something that maybe we've spoken about on occasion, but don't have as much experience training for, especially if you're not on a container vessel. And one of the concerns that always has to be considered is the amount of time it would take, especially in a situation like that, to look up what the cargo is, then look at the specific firefighting requirements of that cargo. And this is where, once again, having the training and the ability to make the decisions as to, should I just start putting water at that fire now? Should I risk it? Or do I have enough time to go find what the data sheet says, is a concern that we would have out in the maritime industry. Now, Reed, how would we mitigate these high consequence, low frequency events like I just described?
Yep. Okay. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. So when we learned about the recognition prime decision model, it tells us that experience is very important to critical decision making. And what you heard from Rich a few minutes ago and just now from Matt shows us that is the case. In fact, you probably in your own experience know you make much better much better decisions when you have experience. But there's a problem. By their nature, low frequency events, especially low frequency, high consequence events, don't have any experience associated with them. You can't walk into the situation with experience. And it's going to be tough because of the way people think and how they can apply their cognitive faculties to really make something up from scratch when you're in the middle of a storm. So how do you prepare? How do you deal with this? Well, the first is training. And Rich mentioned that a little bit a few minutes ago. You want to make sure that all of your protocols that you're trained for, your methods and your skills are as broad and as applicable as possible. Train, train, train all the time. And not just for your everyday events. Train your skills so they're broad enough and applicable enough so that they can be expanded to handle something easily and comfortably that you haven't dealt with before. And then the second part is you've got to have experience. We know that experience is important, but in these low frequency events, you're not going to get experience. So you have to get what we call a surrogate experience. And the way you get that is through scenarios, either in your training activities, on board in your drills, or just by yourself or with your friends. You actually set up scenarios and you walk through them. And you do it over and you do it over and you do it over until it becomes habitual. That's surrogate experience. Nothing for these low frequency events can really compare to that or substitute for that. It's absolutely necessary. And then after you do your scenarios and your training, then you should have drills. A drill is not training, really. It's about setting up a situation and testing you to see if you're really able to do it. So you should have drills frequently, not just once a year, but very often. And some of those drills, perhaps on shipboard, should not be announced. You should have to wake up in the middle of the night and go do the activity as if it were really occurring. And then if you can do it under those circumstances, you know you've got it down. So that's the trick. It's not complex, it's not rocket science, but you got to put some effort into it. Back to you, Matt.
Oh, I think we've pretty much covered what we set out to discuss today, gentlemen. And I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and speak with us about this matrix, which could be a very valuable tool for any industry, not just the maritime industry, but really for anything that we do. Keeping that matrix in the back of our head can help us whenever we make a decision from, as we discussed in our last video, what socks to put on, to what oil to put in my car, to whether or not it's safe to jump out of a moving vehicle and dance alongside while trying to videotape myself. So this is a really great example of how we can use this matrix in our everyday lives. So I really want to thank you both for joining me here today.
It's a great pleasure.
It's a pleasure, Matt.